Good morning, Nick. Good
Good
to
to
see
see you,
you.
Matt. I'm doing all right. How about you?
I'm doing well. Doing well. I'm enjoying the fact that it's a little cooler today. And I'm also excited because I think our internet connection is much better than last week. We were having
Mm,
problems, and then it was spotty. Looking at the video, I was like, it wasn't that great. And then that night is when we had that massive storm
right.
going without power and knocked out our internet. But that was actually great because that led to fixing the internet problem. So all good.
Well,
Okay. What's that?
I would say we need it today because we're gonna be every word could matter. We're talking about some deep stuff.
Deep stuff today. Right. We are talking about something that's on everyone's mind, what we call self-relationality. And it's actually fundamental to our approach and our understanding of human nature and how that informs all the work we do, the courses that we're developing, have developed, are developing. And we decided to talk about this based on our conversation last week, which was, can't really call it a review. It was really a discussion about Tomorrow Mind, the book Tomorrow Mind. And we're thinking perhaps next week we're going to talk about self-worth theory of achievement motivation, which is the basis for Nic's book, Beyond Grades. So we'll be promoting the book heavily next week. So you can run out and get your copy now. Anyway, so self-relationality. Now, one funny thing about that term, and then we'll get into discussion, is if you recall, Nic, we were struggling with what to call our company and the organization or whatever. And I can't remember, I think it might have been you. You were like, why don't we call it self-relationality? And we both thought that was a brilliant idea because it's so fundamental to what we are. And then I think it was one of our wives, it might have been mine, Kim, said, "Are you crazy? That's the worst name possible. Who knows what that word even means, and you're going to call yourselves that." And I think it's what makes that more ironic is that I led a creative agency and we did a lot of branding. I think if we had come to our company and we suggest that name, we'd be like, oh, I would have shot it down instantly. But for myself, that was great.
Well, can I offer a little bit of a defense?
Yes.
I mean, we knew we were going against the current, and so we were thinking, well, we're going against the current in the message. Let's pick a word that people will go, what? And then some subset of people would look into that. And we thought that the people who are curious about that and those words resonated. Now, whether that's a good strategy is another matter, and I will defer to experts. But there was a kind of logic that I think does reflect our deep approach, and self-relationality is at the core of that. So,
right. Yeah. Well, I did give a talk at a conference on dissonance in marketing. So that's
yes, I remember that.
That would have been dissident,
Yes,
for sure. Okay, so this term self-relationality, yes, it's going to be really theoretical, but we're going to end with a so what? Like, what are the practical implications of self-relationality? And that so what section, which we will from now on include, was born out of an interaction I had with a neighbor earlier this week, and I told Nic about this, who actually watches our video, which got us both excited. And she said she loved them, but did say that she felt like some of it was a little over heady. I keep thinking about Gulliver's Travels. There's the one group who are in the balloons or up in the air, it's all abstract. I'm like, okay, we're up there with them. So where I think theory is really important because it informs the practical, but in the end, people want that practical advice or strategy. So we're going to make sure that we end with that. But let's dive into self-relationality, because that's what we're here to talk about today. So how best to approach this, Nick? Do you want to start off, or what do we do?
Let me start a brief, say something briefly, and then hand it to you. So I think that concept I learned from you. I think I was approaching it without the term, from a psychological point of view, and certainly self-relational has a psychological component, but I think it's even more fundamental than that. We might, like you said, about human nature. Even a word I like is it's kind of organismic. It's fundamental to being a human being. In psychology, there's an analogous phrase. It's called self-processes. So sort of these processes at many different levels, motivationally, cognitive, emotionally, affectively, that we construct and then have a relation to ourselves. So how we process through ourselves in all these different ways. So I think there's an analogy there. And that's kind of my angle. And I frequently find myself in the psychological plane, let's say, thinking like a psychologist. That's kind of my training. And I find that you take it to a philosophical level, and self-relationality is often the concept that is the entryway to this other more fundamental strata or domain with which to think about. And it's basic and fundamental. And the examples you give are often very, very relatable. Like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. I'm thinking this, or I'm experiencing that. So it's abstract in one sense and theoretical, but it's also the very fabric of our daily experience. I just want to, I think I'll defer to you. I'd want to signal that to anybody listening. It's not that we don't experience it or have some relation to it. We just don't have words for it. We don't notice it, it seems to me. So with that basis, I would kind of hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you're right. I think what's really hard is we have these moments or periods in life when we are reflective or self-reflective or introspective. We go, yeah, okay, I'm relating to myself, if you want to phrase it that way, but in those discrete, intermittent times. And so to come and say, well, actually, you're doing it all the time. You are relating to yourself all the time seems foreign, and foreign to our experience. So that's kind of one of the big hurdles, is to get over that. So, but then to say, well, you're self-relational, in itself can seem odd, or an odd way to phrase the dynamics that are going on. So I was thinking about this because, yeah, it's pretty much at the heart of my research and what writing I've done. And it was, I kind of came to the realization through working on Kierkegaard. He has a book called Sickness Unto Death, and he begins the book with this section that's like nearly impossible. When you first read it, like, what is going on? Because he's saying like the self is a relation, but it's not just the relation, it's a relation relating to itself. And it's like all these kind of words. But basically what he's saying is that there's this dynamism, this dynamic that going on inside us, called what he would call self-relate, that we are relating to ourselves, and that is always going on. And the fact that that is always going on means that it informs every thought, every decision, our experience, how we construct our experience. Everything is informed by this dynamic that's going on inside of us. And so I was thinking about how to get into this idea last night, and I wrote out, and I started with the question, who am I? And the very fact that we can ask that question shows that we're self-relational, because we are there's this self that's asking itself, who am I? And that's a question we often
You can
ask.
hear me. For me, you just froze there for a second.
Yeah, same here. So we're still having internet issues. So let me repeat that.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, so the very fact that we can ask this question, who am I, means that if you break it down, there is this being, this self, this something that is asking itself the question, who are we, or who am I? And that ability is you know, seemingly unique to human experience. And it can lead to these experiences of wonder, exploration, anxiety, depression, a sense of lostness, nothingness, whatever. I mean, there's this, like, when you have that ability to ask a question, you're like, well, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be Matt Frawley or Nic Voge or whoever, whoever watching this? Whereas, the lion and the Serengeti isn't necessarily pondering, well, what does it mean to be a lion? Like, I don't know. Is this all life has? Is, just eating and mating and replicating and whatever, defending my pride. I mean, so there's this question of who am I? Now the thing is, are we asking that all the time or just at certain times in our lives? And I would say that question, that in a way is gets you to think about, when you're asking that question, you're asking, like, do I have meaning and purpose and worth? Who am I? Do I have purpose? Do I have substance in this vast world that's out there? So that to me is a way to kind of start to sense that we are self-relational. And Kierkegaard and I would say, that is something we're doing all the time, even when we're unaware of it. And we are always seeking, trying to secure or affirm a sense of meaning, purpose. And if you see that, then every decision, every thought, every action, every choice is bound up in that process. And if you believe that, then there's nothing we do that's random. Everything is bound up in that fundamental quest for meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. And so, as Jim Loder, my mentor in grad school and Princeton Seminary, would say, the secret secretes. What's going on inside you, and that fundamental struggle to find meaning, purpose, is always expressing itself, pressing out of your heart or your inner self into your actions and your thoughts and how you're experiencing reality. So there you go.
So maybe a few thoughts, and maybe to kind of sum up. So we humans have this unique capacity of relating to oneself that we can clarify by comparing it, say, to a lion. They clearly seemingly don't have that, and we can't think of any other organism that does. And so that humans have this capacity, and then that capacity leads to particularly this relationship to ourselves. So we're conscious of ourselves, and I think we might get later, we're also conscious of other people's consciousness, and maybe that they are relationship to themselves, so we can have an understanding of that. And so that relation in particular then leads us to ask certain kinds of questions. It's an ever-present relationship, and it's dynamic, right? So there's this relation, it's a dynamic, it's evolving as we go through the world. So the human nature, I think in Kierkegaard's terminology, is the anthropology. The human condition is to be in the world in that way, with these capacities. And there's a fundamental need to find meaning, purpose, fulfillment. And that's even more basic than in some cases than other needs, in the sense that maybe people recognize or think about. I don't think it's controversial to say humans have needs and drives. I don't know that how often meaning, purpose, and fulfillment is considered in those, or considered at most basic. And basic, not be simple, but basic as in fundamental, and that shapes your moments of your actions at every moment, your choices, decisions. And I think you gave this example. We gain an insight into that. There's certain times when we realize, wow, I did that, or chose that, or thought that, or felt that in that moment, or that interaction, as something that had to do with me more than them. And I can even say, well, maybe to protect myself, or to present myself in a particular way, or to seek a certain kind of feeling, whether that be self-esteem or self-worth. And I think if you think about all these common phrases we have that have the word self as a prefix, you realize, oh, wow, not only is this so fundamental, self-esteem, self-concept, self-worth, self-regard, but sometimes the antidotes, right? So like the inner critic of as a writer, the self as critic. There's a field, there's a new intervention in psychology, self-compassion. We talk about self-talk. This is pointing to, at a psychological level, right, what you're getting at. But I think people aren't putting it together and saying, yeah, but it's the self part is part of everything. And I think that's what I've learned from you about the idea of self-relationality, that as the core, and it does converge with self-worth theory. My mentor, Marty Covington, has a talk on, you can find, he talks about self-worth as the beating heart of motivation, right? This core of the cognitive dimension that provides the energy for these actions. I don't know that he ever read Kierkegaard or talked about self-relationality, but I can see some continuity there.
No,
so what?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say, I think it doesn't have to come from one person. I think that's what's so exciting to me, is that, yeah, Kierkegaard really took perhaps more time than others to really explore that and try to understand that through his own introspection. But then he used to be called Copenhagen's most famous peripatetic. But he would walk around town, but then he wouldn't often just talk to people to chit chat. He was always kind of exploring this idea and testing people on it and whatever, to the point where people would go to the other side of the street because they didn't want to talk to him, because they knew that he was in his own head doing his experiments to try to figure out human experience that much more deeply. So
that's interesting.
But I was going to just say, but the fact that Buddhism and contemplative Christianity, in a way, have there can be this engagement, is because they're both focusing on introspection. And now again, it's a very important point. They're going to diverge, but there is this common path, I would say, at the beginning. When you begin to introspect, there's going to be people from a wider range of experiences or philosophies or religions who are going to say the same things. So the fact that Marty Covington was somewhat leaning towards where Kierkegaard was, to me, makes absolute sense. Yeah.
Right, they're converging on this deep insights about what it means to be human beings,
right,
and coming at it from different vantage points. Yeah. So that, I think from a listener's or viewer's point of view, we get a sense of what it is. What's in terms of moving toward a so what in that application, what's the next step here? How do we help people get to a point where they can think about how they can notice it in their lives and their experience, or what they can do with it, or how it informs our approach? What's a next step in your explanation?
Well, I think there's a couple points. First of all, is to say that I think it's important to emphasize that is the fundamental beating existential spiritual heart of each of us. So I know today in a lot of literature there's this idea that we are communal social beings, that what's fundamental for humans is to be in some kind of relationship with other people in a way that you're feeling that, and that's how you feel
affinity, belonging, approving,
whatnot. And I would say, well, perhaps, but that's not fundamental. That you're just suggesting that is one way to find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. And so now, and by saying that, we kind of somewhat relativize that idea of social, then we can evaluate it. So, for example, I don't know if you've read David Brooks's, what's it called? How to Know Somebody, or How to Know. You know who David Brooks is, right?
Yeah, I know. That's his latest book.
And I can't remember the title, but it was interesting reading it because he emphasizes this point that yes, we are social beings, communal, meant to be in belonging. But then he's talking about, well, how do I help someone feel like they belong in this community? And I'm sitting there like, oh, that's a completely different motivation. Because if I'm so focused on belonging and my need for belonging, then that's how that informs all my decisions. And I'm trying to help my environment help me feel that I belong. So as soon as I start helping someone else feel more belong, well, am I doing that so I feel more belonging? Or if I do that for that other person, well, if I do it for the other person, then am I doing it for my need for belonging? I think except there's these contradictions that he doesn't address.
So I think right there, that kind of uncovering and unpacking of these layers with a lens of self-relationality allows us to ask certain kinds of questions that take one's own introspective analysis to another level, right? So I think what you just said, probably a lot of people could recognize that maybe in the moment they feel like they're acting in someone else's interest, or they're acting out of an altruistic aim, and then they look back and say, wait a second, what was motivating that truly? And I think the reason I'm underscoring that is I think we want to tie the concepts with someone's experience and say, and that's particularly important because the claim is you're experiencing it all the time, but you may not notice it, or you're not aware, it's obscured or covered or under these layers, but it is accessible. And it occurs sometimes, it just sort of pops up, we experience it, it secretes, but other times we can actually look for it, so to speak. We can retrospect and introspect with an intent to say, what's motivating that? And is that what I want to be motivating me, it seems to me, or is that healthy? Is that acting on what's most basic or fundamental for me?
Yeah, I think there's, this is another point. I think we tend to create illusion. I hate to say illusions, but it's kind of illusions where we abstract away from ourselves, because to do that introspection it's often messy, it's painful, it's uncomfortable, in a way, it's the way to self-improvement, which we'll talk about later on, but it's hard work. And it can lead to a certain paralysis, right? If you're so motivating, you're so introspective, you're like, you do have to make choices and whatnot. So hopefully we'll get to it. I just want to say it's not meant to be like, wow, if I wear red socks today instead of blue, what does that say about me? What am I motivated? I mean, like, you got to go on and you have to go about your day. But there is a pathway to self-improvement, and that's, for us, that's why, I follow a contemplative Christian path and you're a Buddhist path. But we do tend to abstract away from ourselves. We can do that spatially, which I'll talk about in a second, or we do that temporally. Like, we tend to be focused on the future, like if this will change, or if I get a new job, or if I just need to get to my vacation, or if I get a new partner, or we're focused on the past through guilt. We tend to not focus on the present, and that's really hard. So we're to focus on the present in a self-relational way is difficult.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. Oh, did you want to keep going?
Oh, I just could say spatially. I remember at this when at the seminary, especially, what was great about Princeton Seminary at the time was there was a rich forum of diverse beliefs, and so I came in with one particular set of beliefs, and you were at the lunch table with people who had different set of beliefs, and it would lead to these lively debates. And often they were courteous and healthy debates, but sometimes they would get heated. And when they got heated, it would be easy for me to think like I'm standing up for the truth, and what a great Christian soldier I am to fight for this belief. And then a couple of years later, I'm like, was that really my motivation, or was it because I wanted people to see that I was right or that I was smarter? And I didn't see that at the time. But that was, again, to your point earlier, like that was the self-relational component. Like I was really motivated by a need to assert myself, get other people to see that I was right, and show that I was smart. And so if you disagree with me or you wouldn't like listen to me, even though I wasn't listening to you, you didn't listen to me, I got frustrated and angry. And, then it got heated. And so I, at the time, was not at a point where, or had the self-reflection to see that that was really what was motivating me to act in that way. I was in this illusion that I was this great Christian soldier standing up for the truth.
Right.
That's an example. That would be more spatial, I would say, because I was kind of out here in the ideas in the moment versus really kind of understanding, like, well, why am I saying this? Why am I getting frustrated? That kind of things. Yeah. So
and that can be contrasted with the temporal you said before.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we remove ourselves from our own experience, from being aware of our own experience by putting our mind in the future. Like, if only this will happen, then the effect of that, then if I get this job, or this thing happens in the world, or have this relationship, or the weather, or I live in a place this is what's on my mind lately, to be honest. If only, right? But the effect of that, so that's a very human tendency. We have prospection, but the effect of that is to take me away. It also is based on this idea that your happiness will be dependent upon your external, or something in the future. It's not here, but it will be then if something happens. And that something happens, getting connects to the spatial, which is that thing that happens is outside of me.
Right. Well, it's also, but it's also, we do it, and then we don't say, well, why am I doing this? Like, I'm here right now, and I'm needing this future event that's going to somehow change my external environment. And so we don't see what we lose by being so outside ourselves. We lose the present moment and what can be done right now. Secondly, we don't see that there is this dependency on our external environment, which may need to change. I mean, it's not to say that isn't, but then you're so focused on this external event and this happening that you're not working right now to somehow improve yourself in your environment or the environment right now. So you're losing the present moment.
So, and I think just to make it, I think I'm right, explicit, and all of that is meant to sustain my sense, the need I have for a certain sense of self that I have, my relation to myself, kind of through you, right, through the external world. And so that's where the self-relationality comes from. Right? The external world, these achievements become, or what have you, or material objects, or what I hope or believe to be your perception of me, and I'm trying to cultivate that. So in my era, that was very similar to that. I look back and say, but I was trying to be a smarty pants all the time. I call it my smarty pants chapter of my life. I was trying to show how smart I was. Well, wait. I often thought of as I'm trying to be right, I'm trying to educate these people. They don't know. I'm lucky. I even say I had this little story. I had this education. It's not untrue, but and there's that reason it was part of it. But was that what's motivating me? Was that and there are times when you see this departure, right, where you're some action, you say, wait, if that were the motivation, then I would have zigged, not zagged. So what does that tell me about my motivation, my true motivation? Even though I might be representing myself or telling myself a certain thing. So I'm simply trying to educate myself, learn this, and know as much as possible and share the truth. Is that really the only motivation? Is there something beneath that? Can I gain insight into that at times? And I think too, I look back on that and said, oh, there's some expressions of acquiring knowledge, of gaining insight that I value, but for a purpose that I didn't value. So for my own self, I've tried to say, okay, my smarty pants chapter is hopefully over. So what's the new chapter? And I try to think, in the Buddhist tradition, would be wisdom. So wisdom is different than knowledge, in part because it's rooted in compassion for oneself and others, and actually recognizes. So I just say that very much what you said here, I've read and and Buddhism is a very broad framework, but I've read virtually many of the same sort of things. But wisdom, for instance, has a different kind of motivation, right? It's not my self-aggrandizement. It's compassion for your difficulties and suffering and pain. Which you could say, okay, wait a second, but why is that? And I think that's really easy for that to be just another layer of self-justification, right? And I haven't fully worked that out in the Buddhist framework, but so maybe you have an insight.
No, I mean, this is where, again, we there's self-relationality in the abstract, and then there's like, okay, what's the core, like once you do it, like where do you go? And so this is where a faith tradition is really important. So for me, the journey has been, first and foremost, and this is part of the so what, is become aware of the motivations, and that is a journey because there's layers. And why do you react to certain situations in certain ways? There are things that quote unquote trigger us and get us frustrated, whatever. Why is that? Like, we often we just kind of deal with it and don't examine what it is about us that leads us to react in that way. And when you begin that journey, to me, is we kind of see perhaps a less than rosy picture of ourselves, and we see how we can be selfish, and we are constantly trying to manipulate our environment to affirm our self-identity, like affirm that we have worth. And I think that's important. I mean, it's a hard truth, but you need to experience that. And then, the question is, well, where are you going to find your sense of worth and truth? And so there's the wisdom tradition. There's better ways to find it. And this is where the David Brooks side of saying, well, I'm really going to think about how to really help this person. I mean, like, and be, I'm like, okay, great. That's awesome. Like that's that a lot of his book is advice on how to do that. And I'm like, this is incredibly valuable. Part of the book is that, all that advice. But anyway, but if wherever your journey takes you makes you less dependent on the need, for people to affirm you, then which is why early Christians, or a lot of contemplatives, were interested in Stoicism. They didn't believe in it, but they definitely saw that there was a lot of truth there. Like, because with Stoicism, you're trying to, in a sense, cut off your need for the external environment. Now the question is, where do you go from there? And for contemplative Christians, and why I follow it, is like, if you can not be dependent on the external world, it actually allows you to be more compassionate because you're not wrapped up with your own needs in those situations. And that doesn't necessarily make you a punching bag for other people. It just means that you can respond in ways that, maybe based on wisdom tradition, or for me, just finding the presence of God and trying to really see that as my good, so that I don't need all these other things. I don't need, a better, more prestigious job or this or that. But you can actually be more compassionate because you actually can see and hear folks in a way that you couldn't before, because you were so wrapped up in your own needs and weren't aware of that.
Yeah. And that led to the illusion, or in you were talking about, and in Buddhism, they tend to use the word delusion, which is an obscuration of what's really going on, and seeing yourself and human beings and human condition more accurately, which is awakening. That's what that is, at a psychological level, is what's really going on here. What's the way to look at this that makes me happy and other people happier, and happier in a broad sense, having meaning in our lives, fulfilled, not happiness that is pleasure that comes from, for instance, feeling good about having stuff that leads to pleasure. But I think one thing I might make a connection to is I'm not a psychotherapist, but a lot of psychology and including self-worth theory is grounded in Rogerian, so Carl Rogers' framework, which has roots certainly to others, but I think is the dominant paradigm in most psychotherapy, which is that discourse and talk is on TikTok to pretty much everything. I think one thing that Buddhism says is, well, that's this perseveration of that's more pejorative than I'd say. This attachment and focus on the self is itself part of the problem. And I think a lot of contemporary discussion, and maybe it's a distortion of psychotherapeutic principles, but is, the way to feel better and be in this world is to bolster your self-esteem. And that's a very different strategy than what Buddhism advocates, which says, no, that's you being attached to your sense of self and trying to get other people to give you that in various kinds of ways. And it doesn't get to the root. And I think there's some parallels here and I'll let you speak to that. But I think it's important to say a little bit about that, to say, okay, David Brooks or other people are expressing these models, these ways of thinking about human psychology. Belonging is a big concept that's been talked about a lot lately. Affinity, I think I know where that's coming from in terms of the psychological research on that. Self-determination theory and organismic theory of motivation from DC and Ryan. But I think they take what's conventional or typical of human beings and saying, oh, so that's what we should do.
Right.
So the people that are happy who focus on self in a particular way, let's look at what they do and then reproduce that, rather than saying, maybe we should actually question that and say, what's the problem? What's the likelihood, or does the wisdom traditions, as we survey the world spatially and temporally in history, is that what leads to fulfillment, meaning, purpose, well-being? What are the pitfalls of that way of thinking? So there's a little bit less critical, but then what's the framework? And I think so. Self-relationality is a way of thinking about that. Buddhism is too. It's to kind of get outside the way of thinking that self is kind of all.
Right. Yeah, I actually like that, the way you express that, because this goes to Loder's work, as you know, with psychologists, and like this idea that we can see the world as a threat. Loder had this kind of 4 dimensions of the self, our lived world, the void, and God. And the void is this sense of nothing that always tends to creep in, and so we create this lived world that kind of protects us, and says, no, we are worth something. That void is, we can push that back, and that's the illusion that we have worth through this external environment or through our productivity, anything like that. And then yet this void is always somehow looking for the cracks, and and so that becomes the basis for that need for self-protection. But and so in the contemplative Christian tradition, you have to die to yourself. And that's this idea of baptism. Like when you baptize, you go into the water, kind of like, and they would go back to Genesis 1, if where the Spirit of God is hovering over these waters. That just meant to be chaos and nothingness. And then so you have to kind of go back into the nothingness. You have to kind of let go of yourself, and then you are raised into the presence of God. And then with that, you don't need to hold on or become self-protective, because you're always in the presence of God. And so there's this freedom that I'm not trying to guard myself and protect myself from that void that creeps in, and all these very practical ways when someone you're slighted, or someone says, you interpret someone's remark in a way that makes you feel ashamed. All these ways that we tend to experience that diminishment of ourselves, and you don't need to have that. Now, this is an idealized view, but that's the goal. And so yeah, I think there's this sense of you're still yourself. Like I'm still Matt Frawley, but I'm not this like always seeing how to protect myself through manipulating environment, self-assertion, all these ways. So yeah, what you said was great.
Yeah, I think, and Buddha has some very much a parallel. So that, and I'll so add one more point. And I think that might bring us to the so what a little bit more concretely, perhaps. So Buddhism, there's a talk that you every moment you can die to what you were before, and so this opens this possibility for change and growth, development, to respond, not merely react, by cultivating these capacities that humans have, and create capabilities. And so that, and then the way that gets, as you talked about, so it takes a lot of work and effort. So the Eightfold Path that many people have heard about, that's an intense training system to cultivate the capacities to, one of which is to learn how to die to yourself in various ways, or that's one of the outcomes. And from a very psychological, at least to some extent, point of view. So very much a parallel there. But I think from our point of view, to the extent that we want to try to intervene and help people, we have to believe that it's possible, right, to not just grow and develop, but to change, to transform, and that the locus of that is actually in you. And so I think my reading of Buddhism affirms that, and I see it as a big thread that ultimately the choices, the actions, the work, the effort, the transformation will originate and take place in you as an individual, and recognizing that that comes often in community too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that ties back to our talk about student agency,
Yeah.
in the sense that, yeah, there's always going to be problems with, you know, your workplace, your university, your high school, wherever, in your home even, you know, and yeah, those need to change, but right this moment, they can't change. So you can, there's work to be done in yourself to help you not be trapped or enslaved by these maladaptions that you've had to protect yourself. And I think that's the hope that we're trying to proffer to folks, that, you know, there's hope, and you can actually lead a much better life now. But the first step is becoming self-aware.
Yeah.
That you have to understand what are the dynamics going inside you that are leading to these self-protective behaviors that are most likely maladaptive and are restricting or limiting your ability to lead a healthier life.
So
So
this awakening leads
yeah.
to the liberation.
Yeah. So I thought, as a so what, I wanted to give a story as an example, and this goes back to our talk. I don't know if it's okay to say, I'll say the university. We were down at Johns Hopkins. Nick and I were hired to give a series of talks to the men's lacrosse team, and we were. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you had.
Oh, yeah. We did a few, right?
Yeah, we gave 4 talks, I think. But I remember the first time I walked into the lacrosse building, it was like I felt like I needed to take my shoes off and genuflect. You know, it was like oh, it was like this temple to you know, what was one of the, you know, the great lacrosse programs, collegiate lacrosse programs. Anyway, our first talk was on drugs and alcohol, if you remember this.
Mhm.
And you know, so they had this just gorgeous room, you know, with all the bucket seats for all the players, and you know, they come in and they, you know, they could tell they're just like, all right, we got to get this, you know, drugs and alcohol talk. Here we go. And so Nick and I started off, and we said, okay, let's pretend you're an alien species, and you're very curious about these humans, and you send a team of anthropologists to come down and study them. What would their report include? Like, what would they say about humans? Like, what are humans all about fundamentally? And I think initially they threw out kind of some silly ideas, you know, their sex, and you know, like they were trying to be serious, but then very quickly they came to the idea that we're about seeking meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, and we didn't have to really prompt them about that. They said,
I remember that.
like it was great. And then we asked the question, we said, well, is that intermittent or is that something going on all the time? And they said, well, oh yeah, it's always going on all the time. We're always seeking meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. We said, great. So we kind of put that aside. And then we asked them to describe the, drinking, and even the drug culture at Johns
partying culture, yeah.
Partying culture, yeah. And so they were great. They talked about, okay, I think it was, we're at Princeton University, it's usually Thursday and Saturday night are the big party nights. Johns Hopkins, it's usually Saturday night. And then we said, okay, why do people drink? And they were like, oh, like what are the reasons behind that? They're like, well, you're stressed out. It's a way to kind of relieve some of the stress and the pressure. It's a way to get rid of the inhibitions. Because then you might be more inclined to approach that person you're attracted to. You're instantly funnier, you have more greater political insights, and you're a better dancer. So they went on with all these reasons, and we said, okay, great, because that showed a certain level of motivations. And we said, okay, let's bring back our initial discussion. You said that we are always seeking meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, always. That's going on all the time, every moment. How do you reconcile these two? The drinking, partying culture, and the motivations behind that with meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. And it was a great moment because we weren't trying to be evaluative or condemn them in any way.
Prescriptive, yeah.
Prescriptive, tell them, do this, don't do this. This was our approach. And boy, did it get quiet, because they had this shock moment because they realized that in a way they were absent to themselves. And it got tense too, because some people realized the implications of, if I'm catering to these ways of drinking that they had said was prevalent, what does that say about how I seek meaning, purpose, and fulfillment? We just let them discuss, and it became a very interesting discussion. And it was great because the next time we came back, they said a bunch of them, I don't know if you remember this, they said I think they did go out and party, but they, as a group, sat down and really said, why are we partying? So I'm like, okay, that's a step forward, I guess. But I think that's practically we tend to live at this kind of surface level where we're just kind of creatures of habit. We're just kind of going along, kind of doing whatever we're doing. And we somehow accommodated that to our need for meaning, either by dismissing certain actions and not really analyzing them. And we're just kind of going about our day. For me, a lot of the so what was to say, okay, I have my day. A lot of it is stuck in this kind of mundane rote work sometimes, or I'm just kind of absent to myself as I'm doing something. For example, and this is really trivial, I was a typical, and probably still am, a typical New Jersey driver, where everyone drives. If only people would drive like I drive, everything would be fine, but they tend not to, so it's frustrating. I used to be, give that horn a good workout. People were always driving slower and whatnot, and I'm like, well, it took a while for me to realize I'm reducing people to objects that are obstacles for me, and I'm perpetuating my own frustrations onto others out of my own need to get somewhere faster, to get through this drive faster. Some these, and again, it seems trivial, but that's who I am. I'm reducing people to objects and obstacles that I need to get out of the way, and then I'm trying to manipulate them through my horn, through tailgating, and people say, well, so what? But yeah, don't you? I mean, that's how I'm treating humanity. That's who I am. And I was like, that's not who I want to be. And so again, that's trivial, but that's the present moment and what I'm doing. And so to come to that realization was important for me. And that's informed how I work, how I take, how things happen in my life. Like, as like I was let go from I co-led this company for 6 years. Our parent company let a bunch of us go, I being one of them. And, am I bitter about that? Do I want to see them, decline or plummet in revenue because they let me go. There is that temptation, but what does that say about me that I would want that? So the so what is there's a lot of we there's a lot of well that if I cater to that bitterness or those frustrations, that's unhealthy for myself and for others. So how do I and for me as someone who's trying to seek the presence of God, I'm not focused on that at all. If I was, then I would drastically change how I interact with people in a way that's beneficial for me, incredibly beneficial for them, and then makes everything we do that much more rich. I think that's what's so exciting about Buddhist thought, contemplative Christians, and Kierkegaard is the really good ones, good writers. It doesn't take you out of life or take you out of the world. It really thrusts you back in so that every moment can be really rich and exciting because it's personal growth. There's a richness to life that we often miss because we are absent to ourselves. So that's kind of initial so what on my part.
Mm-hmm. One thing that came through to me as you were talking is, what I think what the theory and your concern is, well, what is theory for theory's sake? No, but theory becomes the lens through which we introspect and gain awareness. And I've always felt that this was an interesting kind of paradox in my role in introducing, say, self-worth theory to people, that it is strange that I'm going to give you some thoughts, some frameworks, some ways of thinking that you're going to apply to yourself, that you're going to then gain insight about yourself in its deep levels because of what I said. Or I can say things that give you insight to you. Like, how is that? It's also a big responsibility, but how can that be? How can I know something about you that you don't know? And I think it becomes from these powerful, rich ways of thinking about human beings that have emerged over the eons and wisdom traditions, what we call theory. But that theory allows us to look with some clarity at ourselves, an analysis, introspect, that yield insights, not only about how the world works or how humans work, but how I work, right? You make a lot of claims like that's how I act. That's what I do. And that's the basis. Those realizations, on the one hand, provide the motivation. Like, I don't want to be that way. So that's a motivation to change. But it also gives us a kind of suggests a target to change. Well, what do I want to be like? I don't want to be like, what do I want to be like? And also suggest the pathway to change. And I think that's crucial to our work, right? That's why the theory is so relevant, because I think a lot of what we're doing is saying, we want to help you change in the ways you want to change. And many of the interventions are surface and simplistic, and they're not based on you gaining a fundamental understanding because they're not grounded in a deep understanding of human beings. What I say is I work with students. So you're a student some of the time, but you're a human being all the time.
Right.
And so an understanding of being a student or the context is one part of the equation, but really understanding your humanness and how that manifests is the basis for what we're doing right now today in your class, and how you choose and how you allocate time and make decisions. But also the richness of that is you're a human being all the time. You're going to continue to be, right? You are a part of every situation you're in. So gaining that insight is the most powerful knowledge. And I guess the last point I'll make is maybe education used to cultivate that. Perhaps religious education did, but contemporary education doesn't do that. Yet teenagers and young adults are often thirsting for self-awareness, self-knowledge. So how do we, I ask this question a lot, like, where does that happen? How do we promote that and cultivate that? Can I do that within my role? I see the need, I see the thirst, and then figuring out how education, in my case, as an institution, how can we help students meet that need? Yeah.
Right. Well, that gets back to our first ever Vogue Academy talk, where we talked about self-awareness. And how do you help people become self-aware? I mean, that's something that Kierkegaard spent his life wrestling with, because it's hard, because people are absent to themselves. And as much as you say be self-aware, they could interpret that like, oh, Nic Voge says to be self-aware. They're writing these notes down, so they're still, it becomes this knowledge that is distinct or separate from their own being and self-realization. So yeah, I mean, this is where the idea of dissonance, or that Kierkegaard worked on, and indirect communication and all this stuff that we don't have to get into. But I mean, yeah, what I really appreciate about our collaboration and our work is that there's this idea of self-relationality that can seem so abstract, seems so removed from our daily lives, and yet what we're trying to do is say, look, here are ways in which you are probably got it wrong, or you're like a maladaptation, a way where your accommodation to your needs has led to this less than ideal situation, like procrastination. And we're going to give you the strategies, but behind that is this idea of self-relationality and self-awareness that's going to inform, and it empowers you to figure it out for yourself, because that's what ultimately we have to do. We're going to give you strategies, and even the course, as you know, is laid out. Here's all these strategies for all these dimensions of your experience, your lived experience. But we don't know you. We don't know what's going to work for you. So you have to become self-aware, and then figure out what strategies are best for you. And even with the course that will be coming out, which should have come out already, but still, creative problem solving, we're really grappling with the flight, fight, or freeze response, because often in new and challenging situations, they become threats. And so how do you overcome that? And so there's a really rich understanding of self-relationality and the human condition to understand what's going on there. So, and all our courses will be like that. So anyway, not to promote our work, but that is kind of the so what is that we're really taking the self-relationality, the deep understanding of human nature, and we have to, because if we don't,
right,
what we offer is going to be misinformed. That's like one of the key things for us, is like we have to get our anthropology, our understanding of human nature right, because we're always ourselves. We're always grappling with that. And so if this self-relationality is always there, and it's informing everything that we do, how can we not speak about it or have it inform how we're trying to help people out? So I think I can affirm that we're doing the right thing, Nic.
Yeah. A phrase popped into my mind, so I'll say it. So I think deep understanding is necessary for deep change. And I think a lot of people are thirsting for deep change.
That might be a new tagline for our website.
Okay.
What did you say again? Deep
understanding is necessary for deep change. And I think a lot of us are looking for deep change, transformation.
I like that. I thought that's a perfect way to end. So again, we're going to continue this discussion away by diving into self-worth theory of achievement motivation. I'm saying that right? That's the way. Right? Next week, which is part of Nic's book, Life Beyond Grades, that he wrote with Marty Covington, his mentor, and I can't be able the
another mentor, Linda von Hunde.
Okay,
yeah,
right. So that'll be really awesome. Nic, as always, thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you have a great way of expressing and things, and I'm always feel like I'm wandering all over the place. So I really appreciate your insights, and just talking with you. It's really helpful to me.
Well, it's a wonderful introduction to self-relationality from an expert on it. So thanks so much.
Thanks. All right. Till next week.